Good afternoon, everyone. This is Mark Fowler, and I'm the Managing Director of Programs at the Tanenbaum Center for Interreligious Understanding, and we're very excited to be presenting this webinar today, addressing the December dilemma in schools. In particular, I'm also very excited for the partnership and certainly want to thank Sarah Wicht, Tom Ronk, and everyone at Teaching Tolerance who've worked on this project with us over the past few months. It's a very exciting topic. We hope that it's a timely topic for you. There are some housekeeping issues which we'll discuss later on regarding the use of the polls and the chat feature, but for right now I think we should just keep going and get started with the content. So, and for your information, we're in New York, and I am joined by colleagues in the education program, Marcy Denberg-Sarah, who will introduce herself, who is co-facilitating this session with me, Marisa Fasciano, who works with our program, Yael Goldstein, who is our project assistant for the education program, and so we're all here in New York. So you may hear some sounds of the city, because we're not in a soundproof room, but we hope not many. And we can go to the next slide. Okay, so just a quick word about our work. Tanenbaum is a secular, non-sectarian organization. Our mission is to combat religious prejudice, and we do that in practical ways by providing opportunities for training like this webinar, as well as resources and technical assistance. We have 4 program areas, but our focus today is on our education program. And let me just we'll go to the next slide. You can see who's talking to you. So there I am, the big talking head. And then I'd like at this point to introduce Marcy Denberg-Sarah, who is our program associate.
As Mark said, my name is Marcy, and I work in the education program at Tanenbaum. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. I'd like to introduce you to our colleague at Teaching Tolerance, Sarah Wicht. Sarah?
Hi, Marcy. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. Thank you, Marcy and Mark, for having Teaching Tolerance as part of this collaboration on the December Dilemma webinar. We're very happy about what we're able to present today. As I said, my name is Sarah Wicht, and I am the Senior Manager of Teaching and Learning for Teaching Tolerance. And Marcy, you can go ahead and move to the next slide.
Sure.
To tell you a little bit about Teaching Tolerance, we were started by the Southern Poverty Law Center in 1991 when our founders, Morris Dees and Joe Levine, said that our work in classrooms must complement our work in the courtroom. And for over 2 decades, we've been working toward our mission to reduce prejudice, improve intergroup relations, and support equitable school experiences for our nation's children by producing high-quality, anti-bias educational resources free of charge to teachers. Those resources include Teaching Tolerance magazine that is published 3 times a year, award-winning film kits, curriculum, professional development, over 500 classroom lessons, and positive school climate resources like our Speak Up at School and Responding to Hate and Bias. Move to the next slide, Marcy.
Sure. Well, thank you, Sarah. So to kind of get back to how we created this webinar, the essential questions that will inform our focus today are, what are our beliefs and why do we celebrate certain holidays? What does an inclusive, respectful classroom look like? Why is it important to highlight different traditions, especially those of minority groups? How can inclusive conversations be started? Those are our essential questions, and we will refer back to these essential questions throughout the next hour. Let me quickly review the objectives for our time together. We designed the webinar and resources that will be provided in the after the session pack so that you'll be able to recognize the complexity of the December dilemma, create deeper understandings of religious and secular holidays and classroom content, facilitate classroom discussions surrounding inclusion and respect for religious and non-religious differences, and then self-evaluate existing classroom resources for strategies for equity and inclusivity. You can go on to the next slide. So here's our agenda. We'll spend time today unpacking the December dilemma through the lens of creating inclusive classroom content. We will review diverse holidays and traditions represented in our classrooms throughout the year, as well as sharpen our lens for assessing our approach to creating inclusive classrooms and content. The next slide. Here are our ground rules. We want to remind you that the webinar is being recorded, and it will be available later on for download. We also ask that you please have some scrap paper and a pen or a pencil available, as we will be asking you to jot a few things down. Participate today and definitely have fun. Be sure also to utilize the materials that will be sent in the after the session pack later on today. And as mentioned earlier, there are many items that we will cover that will require input from you. This input will be required by ways of polls and chatting. The chat feature is located in the lower left-hand corner of your screen, and the poll feature will come up through the slides. We'll let you know when it's time to either take a poll or chat your responses. And since there are so many of us here participating, we'll do our best to incorporate your answers to your questions during the course of the webinar. And I think, Mark, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. So we want to get everyone started actually with using the poll feature. And we're going to do that by giving you two statements to respond to. And you'll have the choice of responding whether you strongly agree, whether you agree, disagree, or strongly disagree with the statement that we're going to bring up. Okay? So we're going to bring the statement up now. And the statement is, I always treat people of other religious faiths with respect. So we're going to give you an opportunity now to vote on that through a poll. And you can begin voting now, and we will share the responses with you shortly. Okay, we have a little bit more, about almost 3/4 of us have voted. If we could ask everyone else to get your votes in. Okay, we're getting close to about 75 to 80%, just a few more people. All right, we're going to go ahead and close the poll. And so here are the results. So everyone on the call, or the majority of the people on the call, and I can tell you that there are about 75 people right now with us on the webinar, and we have 60 responses of people who agree and strongly agree that they treat people of other religious faiths with respect. So we're going to give you another statement to respond to in the same way, to either strongly agree, agree, disagree, or strongly disagree. So let's bring that statement up. Okay, so people of other religious faiths always treat me with respect. So we'll give you an opportunity to vote now. Okay, great. And give you just a few more seconds to get those last-minute votes in. Okay, we'll go ahead and close the poll. All right, so we have a little bit of a difference here. So now we have almost half, about 47% of people saying that they don't necessarily have the experience of being treated with respect by people of other religious faiths, with still a significant number saying that they agree. Now, what's interesting is that these two statements come from something called the Tolerance Index, which was created by the Gallup poll in 2004. And in that poll, 95% of the people said that they always treated people of other religious faiths with respect, but only 65% had the experience of being respected. Very similar to the results that we're seeing today, with 99% of the people participating in the webinar saying that they always treat people of other religious faiths with respect, but only 53 having the experience of being respected by others. We use these two statements as part of all of our trainings across all of our programs, and the results are always the same. There are usually far more people who have the experience of treating others with respect than the experience of being respected. And that disconnection really is the foundation of our work. If you will, it is often the disconnect between intent and impact, that we often intend to be respectful and we think our actions are respectful, but they're not always received that way. Why don't we go on and talk a little bit then about, well, why is this so complicated? What are some of the reasons that actually point to these particular statistics? So let's go to the next slide. So what you see here is the question, how many religions? Well, it really does depend on who you're asking, and it depends on how you're counting. But fundamentally, this is, first of all, let me just say this, that what you see here in terms of the size of the fonts and the colors and the placement, it has nothing to do with favoritism on our part. This is really just a design feature. And if you don't happen to see the way in which you personally identify yourself, we did not purposefully leave it out because we knew you were going to be on the webinar. This is really just meant to be kind of a survey, if you will. But you'll also notice from this slide that there is not just diversity among traditions and ways of believing, but there is also diversity within traditions. And with this being the case, there is no possible way that any of us could actually know everything that we need to know about all of these traditions, even if all of these students were sitting in front of us. But what we can do is actually create inclusive learning environments where, regardless of how you identify, that there is a curiosity that exists within the environment for young people to learn and know about one another. Let's go on to the next slide. So to drill this down a little bit more, we want to take a quick look at diversity within United States religiosity. And from this pie chart, you'll see that this comes from a Pew survey that was conducted in 2007. And you'll see that 24% of people self-identified as Catholic, 11% self-identified as Evangelical Baptist, and those were the largest identifiable groups. What's of note is that 6% of the United States population in 2007 self-identified as belonging to a non-Christian faith. So that includes all Jews, all Muslims, all Hindus, all Sikhs, all Jains, everyone who identifies as a non-Christian faith but of a religious tradition. 16% of people self-identified in a category that has come to be known as the nones, meaning that they are either atheists, agnostics, spiritual but unaffiliated, or have no ties to religion at all. That number has actually grown to 20% in another survey done by Pew at the end of last year in 2012. What's most important about this slide, though, are all of these other colored slices that you see, which are other denominations within Christianity. And you can see that it fades off into slices that you can't even see. So depending on who you ask and depending on how people self-identify, while Christianity may be the majority within this country, there is certainly diversity within that majority. And that means that even when we're thinking about the quote-unquote December dilemma and the holiday season, that there are diverse views, ways of believing, and practices that are included in that. So at this point, I'm going to turn this over to Marcy, and then we'll keep this conversation going.
Sure. And I think as we begin to understand the religious landscape nationally, we can start to consider how those trends factor into our classrooms. Many of you signed up perhaps because the holidays during the month of December present a unique opportunity to actually focus on inclusivity. We can go to the next slide. So as an introduction to what we'll be discussing going forward, we want to get a sense of your understanding of the December dilemma. we're going to use the chat feature in the lower left corner of your screen to share one word that comes to mind when you hear the phrase December dilemma. So please use the chat feature in the lower left-hand corner to share one word that comes to mind when you hear the phrase December dilemma. We'll give you 10 seconds to respond. So we're seeing Christmas, concerts, confusion, diversity, religion, trees.
Biased schools, happy holidays, should we say it or not? Chaos,
Sure.
discomfort, problems, consumerism, students missing school.
Okay, thank you for sharing those concerns. Those concerns and items that you shared is information that we've heard from many educators over the years. In this next slide, Mark will tell you more about how we, as organizations, address these concerns and concepts.
So one of the things, what you see before you is our pedagogy, which includes the 7 principles for inclusive education, as well as 6 behavioral outcomes for students that we believe when educators are able to be trained and to use the 7 principles can produce these results with students and in learning environments. And when working with students to develop what we call respectful curiosity, it really does require a safe environment where young people feel safe sharing about themselves. Holidays are a good way to do that, but certainly holidays that are woven within the content that is being discussed in the classroom. So to tie this, if you will, a little bit to our essential questions, what an inclusive classroom looks like is one where, for instance, teachers are actually modeling behaviors that prevent prejudice, our 3rd principle. And what that looks like is being mindful about generalizations and training young people to distinguish between a generalization and a stereotype. In terms of our behavioral outcomes, if we look at highlighting different traditions throughout the school year, this gives students an opportunity to understand that there really is religious diversity, that even if they happen to be in a homogeneous environment, that there is more than what they see. And by that, religion becomes a state of being. We begin to recognize religious difference as a state of being. And how do inclusive conversations start? Well, they can start when young people have the tools to ask respectful questions about what they don't understand, both about their peers, but also about their communities and the larger world. And we can go on to the next slide. And actually, in this slide, I'm actually going to turn this over to Sarah and ask Sarah if you would talk about the critical practices for anti-bias education that Teaching Tolerance has. Sarah, are you there? If you've unmuted yourself, we can't hear you. Well, until Sarah comes on, I'll just talk a little bit through these. So in terms of you see that there are 4 categories: instruction, classroom culture, family and community engagement, and teacher leadership. And we're partnering with you today. Tanenbaum and Teaching Tolerance are partnering together to address these 4 areas regarding holiday inclusion, but also looking at the holidays as a teaching opportunity throughout the school year. When we think about instruction, we're looking at critical engagement with material and making real-world connections. So if you will, one of the comments that came up, or one of the thoughts that came up when thinking about the December dilemma, was consumerism. So maybe this is an opportunity to actually bring that conversation into the classroom to talk about the ways in which holidays are also opportunities for consumerism. Classroom culture, honoring the student experience and shared inquiry and dialogue. We'll actually talk specifically about that a little further down in the webinar. Family and community engagement, culturally sensitive communication. And I think we all agree that we want to educate ourselves so that no child or no family feels unwelcome in the school building or certainly within the classroom. and then teacher leadership, which we really acknowledge all of you for participating in a webinar like this, that it's the ongoing reflection and learning that we engage in that allows for conversations like this about a lesser-known aspect of multicultural education to, if you will, give us more opportunities to discuss it. So, Sarah, if you're back, do you want to chime in real quick? All right, then I'm going to keep going. So it really wouldn't be a webinar for teachers if there wasn't a... So now we're going to actually have some true-false questions and give you an opportunity and share some results about some holiday experiences within the quote-unquote December dilemma, but also some things to consider on a larger basis. So let's go to the first polling question. True or false, Christians celebrate the birth of Jesus Christ on December 25th. So we'll give you an opportunity to vote. Okay, and just give you a few more seconds. All right, and let me just say that we actually have a number of people who are joining us both by web and audio, so let's close the poll. Okay, so about 92% of you believe that Christians celebrate Christ's birth on December 25th. And while that is mostly true, as a complete answer, it is a little bit false, and we'll talk more about that a little later. Okay, so let's go to the next true and false question. Okay, Kwanzaa is celebrated for 1 week. True or false? And you can begin voting now. Okay, great. Let's close the poll. Okay, so 59% believe that Kwanzaa is celebrated for 1 week, while 41% believe that that is false, that it is not celebrated for 1 week. We will show you our answer in just a moment. Let's go on to the next statement. True or false? Bodhi Day is traditionally commemorated by sitting beneath a tree to recognize the passing of the Buddha. So we'll give you an opportunity to vote. You all are voting much more quickly now. All right, let's close the poll. Okay, so almost 58% believe that it is false that Bodhi Day is traditionally commemorated by sitting beneath a tree to recognize the passing of the Buddha. And that is correct. It is false. It is a day certainly for reflection and certainly for acknowledging the moment when Siddhartha received enlightenment, but not necessarily does it have to be done under a tree. And let us go to the final true-false for this section. True or false? Many Muslims commemorate the crossing of the Red Sea by Moses and his followers during their flight from Egypt on Ashura. And you can begin voting now. We're closing the poll. So let's display the results that 61% of people don't agree that many Muslims commemorate the crossing of the Red Sea by Moses and his followers during their flight to Egypt. That is actually true. It is actually true that on Ashura there are many Muslims who commemorate the crossing of the Red Sea by Moses. So let's go to the next slide just to sum up these results. So when we say that it's false that Christians celebrate Christ's birth on December 25th, there was someone in the chat box who said that the statement doesn't have a quantifying clarity, an example, all or some or most, and we did that purposefully because, if you will, there is something that we call default Christianity. When you live in a country that actually has at least 84% of people identifying as religious and then 76% of people identifying as Christian, the assumption is that Christians celebrate Christmas on December 25th, but there are actually nuances to that when we think about the diversity within Christianity. True, Kwanzaa is celebrated for 1 week. There may be, and I'd be curious to see either in the chat box or certainly email us, the ways in which Kwanzaa may be celebrated by some throughout the year. We talked about Bodhi Day already, and then regarding Ashura, it's true that many Muslims commemorate the crossing of the Red Sea by Moses and his followers during their flight from Egypt, and it has to do with Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, seeing how God saved the Jews as they crossed the Red Sea. And there are a variety of ways in which this remembrance is acknowledged by a variety of adherents to Islam. But we want to use this as an opportunity to go a little deeper into one tradition that may be lesser known. So, Marcy, I'm going to turn this over to you.
Sure. I think in thinking about curiosity for differences, we thought it would be interesting to explore a tradition where there are many adherents, but might not be as well known. So we're going to take a minute and jot down what you know about Orthodox Christmas. Here are some questions that might help guide you. When is Orthodox Christmas celebrated, and why is the celebration important? So you're going to just jot that down on your own scratch piece of paper. Okay. So we can pull up the next slide. First and foremost, we want to share that there are numerous traditions practiced on Orthodox Christmas. On the slide above is some of the information we discovered in our research. Orthodox Christmas can be celebrated in January instead of December because it follows a Julian calendar and it is a public holiday in many countries. Some countries are Egypt, Ethiopia, Moldova, Serbia, Russia, and Ukraine. Traditionally, a Holy Night Supper takes place on Christmas Eve following a full-day fast. But here's the takeaway. In trying to go beyond the facts that sharpen our lens, we want to emphasize the diversity within a religious denomination. Mark talked earlier about the diversity within the Christian religion. We learned that people identify and practice in ways that are quite different from each other. By inquiring into a holiday as well known in the United States, such as Christmas, and expanding that conversation to include Orthodox Christmas, we are expanding our knowledge to become more aware of how we can build inclusive classrooms. We can pull up the next slide. So in addition to creating a pluralistic classroom, we recognize there is apprehension that many teachers feel around the time of December. With that building momentum of Christmas and year-end celebrations, many teachers are just not sure of how to deal with it when parents do not want their children celebrating a particular holiday, while other parents might be adamant about certain traditions being upheld. Through this next activity, we aim to equip participants with practical ways of dealing with these multifaceted issues. There is no perfect answer. So we can pull up the next slide. So here's the scenario. We're going to read the scenario together, and we encourage you to read along. It's time for the annual class holiday party in Mrs. Forte's classroom. In an effort to add an educational piece to the fun and games, Mrs. Forte asks each student to share how their family will be celebrating during the winter break. When it's Michael's turn, he explains that his family won't be celebrating a holiday over winter vacation. He then explains a little bit more about the holiday that his family commemorates at a different time of the year. One of his classmates then asks why he doesn't, quote, just celebrate Christmas like all the other normal people. Michael, visibly hurt, retreats and looks upset. So Mark, perhaps you would like to walk us through a little bit more of that scenario.
Sure. So we're going to talk a little bit about what we saw happen. What did you see happen in this scenario? And we invite you to use the chat box in a word or two. What did you see happen in this scenario? Religious discrimination, hurt feelings, hurt, judgment, offensiveness, ignorance, lack of understanding. Michael was made to feel left out or feel not normal or wrong. Rudeness, unintended disrespect. Teacher making an assumption that all students would be celebrating during that time. Doesn't show if teacher reacts. Okay, so that we know the teacher reads, but we don't know what her reaction is. Missed opportunity to include someone. A lack of teacher understanding. Okay, really great, thank you. Let's go to this slide and continue to work with this a little bit. So one of the things that we see, I'm going to give you the end of the movie, and then we'll go back and we'll continue to drill down, is that one of the things that's happened is that a stereotype has surfaced, and we certainly saw it in several of the comments that came in through the chat box, that there is an assumption that everybody, all of the students, are going to be celebrating something in December around Christmas, and likely that they'll all be celebrating Christmas. So that assumption, that stereotype has really led to at least one child feeling that they are not necessarily included, that they're not a part, and that they are somehow different. But we also want to take note that Mrs. Forte has this yearly experience, and this is something that she's added to it, as well as that we have this student who now has been offset in some way. So let's go to the next slide. What could have been offensive? What could have been offensive in this particular situation? We'd appreciate your comments and your thoughts in the chat box. He wasn't normal, like a normal person. So normalcy is actually coming out from many of you, the idea of normalcy and being made to feel like a minority, being left out. Yet many of you are just reiterating over and over again this idea of normalcy, the lack of acknowledgement of the shared pain in the classroom. Generalizations that all folks celebrate the same holiday. Now, there's an interesting note here. Couldn't she have been assuming that all the students would celebrate the New Year, not Christmas? It's possible. But even there are New Year traditions and New Year celebrations, even within religious holidays, that don't necessarily are in sync with the secular New Year that we celebrate in the United States and around the world on January 1st. So there, again, this is just an opportunity for us to dig deeper. So why don't we go to the next slide? And when we think about, I think we've talked a good bit about this in terms of what could have been offensive, but, and you've all kind of laid it out very clearly, that this idea of not being normal, and what does normalcy look like? And we would say that even within a quote-unquote homogenous environment, even if you know for sure, because you see all the children every Sunday sitting in the church that you attend, that does not mean that within each household there may be some subtle differences about the ways in which people believe and practice that we want to be mindful of, so that that generalization about all people participating in a particular holiday doesn't devolve into a stereotype, and that we don't have more students like Michael having this experience of being disassociated. And I wanted to say that in addition to this, in considering some of teaching tolerance's critical practices, it's important to consider or to be mindful of classroom culture, that knowing and valuing students' lives and the culture, creating this culture of a shared inquiry and dialogue, really does allow us to see exactly the opportunity that lies within. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so we'd like to hear from you now in the chat box. What do you think is important to learn from this experience? What can we take away and actually transition and use for further development of these inclusive, respectful classrooms that we want to have? What are some of the things that that are the takeaways for you from a case study like this? Appreciating differences. Thank you. Not making assumptions. Knowing your students, finding opportunities to know your students. These are coming in fast and furious. Creating a classroom culture that's diverse in its learning style, being able to respect other culture, safe words, opportunities to acknowledge when things are not going the way that we want, forming relationships that are respectful, encouraging everyone to believe that there is no normal, that everyone is different in some way, having this be a teachable moment for students. Typical inquiry methods don't necessarily match the differences in today's classrooms. Really great point. Opening the conversation of what are holidays, holy days, originally now not so much like Hallmark events, but what are their origins? Not waiting until December to address these kinds of topics. Using multicultural curriculum 365 days so students are aware of all holy days. Really great. Thank you so much. Let's go to the next slide. Just to try and summarize some of the things that you said, that, clearly what seemed to be maybe missing a little bit in the case study with Mrs. Forte is that she really had this opportunity, she had this intention that she wanted her young people to be able to share with one another. But the educational component, the goal, seemed to be missing a little bit. What was actually the information to impart? What did she want them to take away? How could this activity be attached to content in some way? And separating, if you will, the personal idea of wanting to have young people get along versus the educational opportunity of the sharing of their various beliefs be an opportunity for somehow to connect this to content. Now, I believe, let's just go to the next slide. One of the things to bear in mind that we talk a lot about at Tanenbaum is the idea of religion being fluid and a dynamic process, a dynamic experience. There's a high percentage of people in the United States, and some of you even on this call, may actually be practicing a tradition that you did not grow up in, or no longer practicing the tradition that you grew up in. Similar kinds of dynamics exist for children in families where this is going on. But we want young people to recognize that religion is not something that was created a long time ago and has no bearing on life today, but that it's a dynamic process that's a part of their lives today and likely will be a part of their lives in the future. So, Marcy, there was something that you wanted to share about this.
Sure, and I'll quickly share. We can go to the next slide. I grew up in a Reformed Jewish household. We always celebrated Passover, but each celebration offered differences. In '91, when I was 12 years old, I celebrated Passover with my family. I remember celebrating with 2 seders, which is the Passover meal, and by not eating bread or pasta for 1 week. 10 years later, at age 22, I had Passover at college. I recall attending 1 seder at the college's Jewish Student Center, and I did not keep the tradition of eliminating bread or pasta for a week due to access of cooking, or rather good cooking. If we look forward 10 more years, at age 32, I was celebrating Passover with my husband and our friends when we were living in California. We hosted an interfaith seder and kept the tradition of eliminating bread or pasta for about 5 days. The observances changed over the years, depending on circumstances, access to cooking, or even the feasibility to host a Seder. Personally, though, through each of these celebrations described, my Jewish identity remained the same, but the way I or my family practiced differed. I would want others to know that I still identify as Jewish, even if I don't celebrate Passover the same way as someone else, or if I celebrated it differently in a previous year. For educators here on the webinar today, we hope you will consider the nuances of your students' celebrations of different holidays and traditions, the fluid nature of religious practices, and how closely religion is indeed tied to culture.
Okay, so just to sum this up and to go back to Mrs. Forte's classroom for a moment, there is kind of like, what do you do in the moment? What's the response in the moment? So one of the things that we think is important is actually to stop and clarify. Clarify first with the student who made the comment, what did he mean by that? Because as we saw in the chat box, as we saw here, it really may have been just kind of an unintentional response and a potential miscommunication. So we definitely want to find out a little bit more about what he meant by the comment, and then also ask him, is there a way that he could have asked the question in a different way, perhaps a more respectful way. Go back to respect, that if you have either rules of respect, which is a lesson that we definitely do with teachers, or some kind of classroom contract that allows young people to really focus in on the idea of what behaviors of respect look like, to reinforce those, to bring those back and make them current. Highlight diversity, which I think we've also seen in the chat box from many of you, that opportunities like this really allow to pause and highlight the diversity that exists both within the classroom, within a neighborhood, within the country in a variety of ways, and then checking in. So we want to check in with Michael, certainly, and find out how is he doing, perhaps in a quiet moment away from other students, how is he doing? And then also, we do want to check in with the student who made the comment and check in with the classroom and find out how are people feeling, what is their response, are there others who actually may have the experience of feeling quote-unquote other, that they have beliefs, practices, traditions that may not be the same as others. So let us go on. Just another note, we can go to the next slide actually. Just another note, quick note about how to respond in the long run. So one of the ways to, I think, respond in the long run is to really challenge what the group norm is around people celebrating holidays. We created an after the session package for you, for everyone who's participating in the webinar, and one of the things in that is a lesson that we call the Garden of Belief. And in that Garden of Belief, it allows for young people to explore not just their own traditions, but a variety of traditions. And it is a mural, an art project, as you can see, not this specific one. You have complete creativity to do with it what you will. But in this, you actually get to explore this idea a little bit more. Let's see. And let us go to the resources. Let's go to that. And we can go to the next one. Okay, great. Thank you. So in terms of what are the resources or some additional next steps that you could take to engage family members. So often, just so you know, I taught public high school here in New York City for 11 years. And it was very interesting that the relationship with parents can be a really fantastic one, or it could be on the complete opposite end of the spectrum. But an opportunity like this is a way to engage family members and engage community, so that there could be maybe a larger discussion about holidays and their importance and the ways in which they play out. I think it's critical, we think it's critical here at Tanenbaum to understand both what the written school policies are, whether that's within your building or your school district around addressing the holidays, as well as what the unwritten school policies are. So what's the conversation in the teacher's cafeteria that does not necessarily policy, but everybody kind of follows. Teaching about religion instead of teaching religion is a critical distinguisher that it is appropriate and really necessary at this point for us to teach about the ways in which religion is a part of daily life, but trying to indoctrinate children into particular traditions, that is not okay. And then also to address holidays throughout the year. We've certainly seen that in the chat box, and I think that the opportunity to address holidays throughout the year really makes this something that's not special. It's not during a special time of year, but it's a part of instruction. So at this point, we actually want to, the part of the after the session pack is a self-assessment around what are some of the ways in which you're already addressing religion, and we're going to do one of those questions with you now, and we'll leave the others for you to do on your own. So let's go to, so the question is, when discussing religion, I specifically design classroom lessons that account for students' diversity, including religious or non-religious diversity. So we're going to give you an opportunity to vote on that. And you can begin voting now. Okay, give you just another couple of seconds. Okay, we'll close the poll now. All right, and so you can see that there's even diversity within which the ways in which we actually address religion and include it in our lesson planning and in our classroom lessons. Everything from very frequently to very rarely. And here's the thing, wherever you find yourself in the process is a great place to start, and we hope that resources that we're offering, the resources that Teaching Tolerance have, can hopefully support you in that process. Now we are going to go to now the summary. Actually, we actually want to have a few moments of Q&A, so Marcy is going to facilitate that discussion.
Okay. Real quick, I want to make sure that Sarah from Teaching Tolerance can be heard. Sarah, can you say hello real quick? Let's try it again. Can you try to say hello real quick, Sarah? Okay. We can't hear you. All right. Well, we're going to get started with the Q&A, and my colleague Yael will try to rectify how we can get you on the line. So perhaps as you were going through the assessment, you might have thought about an additional question or information or resources. We ask that you take a moment to chat in your questions that haven't yet been chatted in, and we will summarize and share our responses aloud. If a question can best be addressed via email, we will be sure to get back in touch with you following the webinar.
So we have Sarah. So Sarah is actually still in, but we can't hear her, so she will give us her feedback through the chat box.
Wonderful.
And we have a few questions here that people have sent to us throughout the course of the webinar, so we want to take a couple of minutes to try and address some of these.
Sure. Okay. Will the students who attend virtually receive a packet? The participants on the phone today will receive an after the session pack that includes student lessons and resources that you can utilize in your classroom. You can click on the question. Okay. So in reading your wonderful questions, would you have both students discuss with each other what happened instead of talking with each student individually?
I think part of that really does have to do with how you set up your classroom culture. So if there is a culture that you already have in place that allows for a whole group discussion, someone had put in safe word during the chat when we were talking about that experience. If you already have a culture developed where the whole group can process moments, where someone may be disassociated in some way, then I think absolutely. If you're in the process of building that kind of culture, then you don't necessarily want to further isolate Michael or even the other student and their behavior.
Sure.
I hope that gets to your question.
You can always feel free to type in another question. We can answer it after the webinar. Another question that we saw up there was what to do when there's already a Christmas tradition in place at the school, for instance, an assembly or a festival of sorts. What to do when something is already in place?
I think one of the things to bear in mind is that there is a distinction between tradition and traditionalism. So sometimes things are done on just like an ongoing basis, and in some instances people could even forget why or what the historical value is or what the content value is. So even with those things that are in place, whether it's a concert or a sing-along, look to see if you can develop it into a content-based learning moment that actually develops the school culture.
So there was another question out there about some guidance on how to involve and create an inclusive experience for students that identify as Jehovah's Witness.
Well, I think that, one of the things that we see in some of our other work, our workplace work and certainly in our work in healthcare institutions, is that depending on the celebration and how it's presented, it may be an opportunity where a Jehovah's Witness student or family may want to participate. But I also think that there's something to be said for honoring people's traditions, and in those instances where you may want to celebrate something that's part of your classroom or part of a school, is there another activity that you can create that allows for full participation, or at least allows for people to express and share about themselves?
Okay, and we have time for one more question. In thinking about a social studies class, the question here, I'm trying to just truncate the question a little bit. The topic of world religions makes it available for us to go a little bit more into depth with each faith, but that could also be a challenge. Is it reasonable to perceive traditions in the general context of Western and Eastern traditions?
Well, I think one of the things that could really be helpful is to actually talk about any tradition over its entire life as opposed to moments of reflection. I mean, I think that if there is a tradition, say, that started in the quote-unquote in the East or in the West, then it's important really just to talk about how that tradition started, how has it evolved, what are the various ways in which it's practiced in a variety of locations. I think if we're in the West, we cannot get away from having a Western perspective, but we can certainly be respectful about and work to be respectful about the history of any tradition.
Sure. And I do see one last thing that we'd like to address. What are some things we can do in a work environment that celebrates Christmas but not other religions? For example, Christmas tree put up or Christmas lunch for employees. What could be done about that?
I see. I didn't. So it's a work environment that celebrates Christmas but not other religions. All right. So I think one of the things that we could actually do, some of the things that we talk about in our workplace training is, again, it's the educational opportunity. So this means going to people and even sharing with them some of the information that we've shared with you in terms of demographics. And I'll say this, that the American Academy of Religions is an organization that actually had a task force that did some work around why is it important at all to even talk about religion or to educate young people about religion. When you look at the number of hate crimes that occur, that the highest number of hate crimes are usually committed by people under the age of 20 years old. It's no longer a matter of just, quote unquote, making the minorities feel comfortable, but this is about a full education. What does it mean to be a fully educated person in our society? So I think that you want to go to the people and make the case for why this is not just including an individual person, but why this is a learning opportunity for all the students and all of the faculty in the school. And I think that has to be our last question given our time.
Okay, we can go on to the next slide. So in summary, there are differences in our beliefs that result in a myriad of religious and secular holidays and traditions that certainly warrant respectful inquiry. We know that no holiday or tradition is more important than another, and we have that opportunity to give equal attention to our students' various traditions by first planning ahead and including the study of holidays throughout the year. Our pack, the After the Session pack, has a number of tools and templates to help you plan ahead. Go on to the next slide. The Addressing the December Dilemma in Your Classrooms handouts, which are in the pack, it will be emailed later on today. It will include an assessment, a planning grid, student units, and other tools and resources. We will also be sharing the recording of this webinar later on. In the time leading up to the December holidays, we will utilize the questions that we could not directly address today through a Twitter activity. More information will be shared in the weeks to follow.
I'm sorry, I just want to put something in, Martha. In addition to the Twitter activity, there's also an opportunity, I think, for us to answer some of these questions on our blog so that we can actually make them available to everyone, because I'm not on Twitter. I'm an old fossil. But many of you are probably. But we'll also try and address your questions through our blog so that we can share this learning with everyone.
Absolutely. You can continue to stay in touch with us and Teaching Tolerance. Here's our contact information, and we'll make sure to include this in the After the Session pack. Sarah, if you can, perhaps if technology is in your favor, if you can talk right now, we wanted to see if that was available.
Or just put it in the chat box and we'll tell people what you said.
Okay.
Sarah says, thank you very much for joining us today.
Sure.
Okay.
So I'll turn it over to Mark.
And so with that, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. We recognize that this is only an hour, but we hope that this starts a conversation and starts, ongoing work. We are here. Teaching Tolerance is available. Please let us know if you need anything else. And we hope to see you again on another webinar. Thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank you. Please stand by.